Shalom. This week we are reading Parashat Lech Lecha, beginning in Genesis chapter 12, beginning to study about the great Avraham Avinu, Abraham, our forefather, the originator of the faith in the one true God of Israel, Hashem, in this world, and his career, his presence, the force of his will and dynamic personality. It just seems to explode across the scene from nowhere. Really, he appears on the stage of history at a very opportune time, which we really need to understand. And in the end of Parashat Noach, we already read about a little brief genealogy of Avraham and his coming from a place called Ur Kasdim, which actually is an allusion, our sages tell us, to the fiery furnace of Kasdim, into which he was thrown on orders of the wicked king Nimrod because of his insistence on the belief in one God. So at a very early age, Avraham began to demonstrate this tremendous power and force and ability to survive. From where did he draw this tremendous power? From the power of truth, from his connection to the one true God. And our sages emphasize consistently that Avraham underwent a series of tests, 10 tests altogether, and these tests were of a very unique nature. As God continued to reveal himself to Avraham, and Avraham began to solidify and pursue his career with more and more intensity, that career being the teaching, the exposure, the revelation to all mankind of the reality of the one true living God. As he began to become more and more committed to this mission, this campaign, this goal, these tests became of such a nature and degree that God's presence for him was consistently more and more concealed. And the more he began to teach about the existence of God, the more in his own personal life he was challenged by the concealment of that very God in his life that he was so insistent exists. So Hashem essentially is plucking him from where he was, from his background in an idolatrous family, and sending him into the world apparently to represent him. And he promises to Avraham that he's going to be giving him this entire land, and he's going to be giving this entire land to his offspring, which he doesn't have any at this point. And then, as soon as that promise is made, bang, immediately we find one of Abraham's tests. We find that there is a severe famine in the land, and immediately he has to get going. He has to leave, he has to move. He goes down to Egypt. There he has a test where they're starting up with his wife. Each one of these tests, again, concealing more and more Hashem's presence from him and making him seem to be further and further away. Afterwards, he returns to the land of Israel, separates from Lot. That's a story in itself. And then again, Hashem reassures him at that point with a beautiful promise, great promise, that this land is going to belong to his entire, his descendants. And we read in chapter 13 regarding this promise, Hashem said to Avram after Lot had parted from him, "Raise now your eyes and look out from where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land that you see, to you will I give it, and to your descendants forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, then your offspring too can be counted. Arise, walk about the land through its length and breadth, for to you I will give it." This is really beautiful. And then, bang, immediately after this promise, Avraham finds himself winding up in the very middle of a war. A very mysterious kind of war. Very hard to understand what this war between 5 kings and 4 kings was all about. We find Avraham was necessitated to take sides. His nephew was kidnapped, and Avraham needed to redeem his relative, this captive, This seems to be the most ancient war on record. It seems to be the first page of political world history. But what is the Torah recording this war and Avraham's involvement? We always know this important and holy principle that there's nothing anecdotal in the Torah, and everything serves the purpose of enlightening us with an eternal truth which will bear meaning upon our lives today. So this is not a social studies lesson, and it's not just an example of a record of early world history. And we can see immediately that this in itself was a tremendous test for Avraham. Hashem just told him, this land is going to be yours and your children's forever. Hashem is the king. Avraham's entire career is based on, with great personal commitment and self-sacrifice, teaching the entire world of the sovereignty of Hashem as king. And now all of a sudden, and that there's really only one king, and now all of a sudden Avraham is plunged into this whole messy geopolitical reality wherein there are 9 kings that are fighting each other. And actually, as the sages teach us, the whole thing really was a subterfuge to get Avraham involved. This is the reason why they took Lot in the first place, because the whole thing was really just a ruse to draw him in order to kill him. And this whole event has tremendous significance. Our sages point out that the 4 victorious kingly powers actually parallel 4 world empires that dominate the stages of history that eventually will fall through the descendants of Avraham. And I think that in order to really understand this scenario of this war of the 4 and 5 kings and Avraham's involvement, and to really understand the Torah's message for us, we would need to go back a little bit, one parsha, to the flood, and talk a little bit more about what happened. Because actually, Hashem, after the flood, made a promise to himself. And his promise was that he would never again destroy the world. He lets us know that he came to some sort of conclusion regarding the inherent, innate, wicked nature of man, and Hashem is as if he was saying, well, maybe I was shooting too high. I'm not going to destroy the world again. And that implies that God was accepting upon himself, as it were, that in the future, to some extent, he would limit himself in human affairs. And that he would allow certain things to transpire, because after all, man is evil. What is this limitation where he had promised that he would no longer destroy the world? Now, if that is the case, isn't Hashem creating a situation wherein powerful men could control the weak, men could seize power and manipulate others, indeed, like the story of these kings? Men could begin to buy favors and influence. Evil governments and alliances could be established and formed. Immorality could actually be institutionalized, as we find it was in the time of Avraham, and legitimized. False gods can be introduced, and state-run dictatorships and machinery for murder and torture could become the norm of the day. In such a situation, who would be responsible for bringing mankind back to Hashem if Hashem promised that he would no longer destroy the world? Who would police this new post-flood world? America? No. Hashem chose one particular branch of humanity through Avraham to guarantee that mankind would find a way back to Hashem. And thus, I really like to refer to Avraham Avinu, Abraham, the first Jew, Avraham Ha'ivri, Avraham who was the Hebrew Ha'ivri on the other side of the world, that he was Hashem's guarantor for the legacy of the spiritual elevation and ultimate redemption of humanity. And this is why he was introduced like a comet blazing across the firmament of history at this particular point in time. So now, understanding Avraham's role in the world, we see him becoming involved in this war of these kings. And these kings, this wasn't just a simple political move. This wasn't just an issue of control. This was about rebellion ultimately against Hashem himself. Avraham, who was the world's teacher regarding the one true king, found himself at odds with a group of evil and manipulative men who took upon themselves the role of king in order to deceive the world and in order ultimately to usurp the true kingship of Hashem. And even in the very names of these men, this is alluded to. First of all, Amraphel, actually our sages teach us, is Nimrod himself, the very Nimrod who was responsible for throwing Avraham into the fiery furnace because of his belief in Hashem. Nimrod actually was perhaps the world's first king. Earlier in chapter 10 of Bereshit, the kingdom that he established is described, albeit he was not called a king there, but we are told about the beginning of his kingdom. He made himself a king. He was the first who began the system of abuse and subjugation of others. And now all of a sudden we're reading about 5 kings in such a small area. It's like a king to every town. So many kings. Later on, by the way, in Joshua's time, we read about 31 kings in such a small land. No wonder Avraham was drawn into this foray. If you remember when we teach about Rosh Hashanah, at that time we talk about how we are focused during that time of year on Hashem's kingship and on making him king. And we talk about the fact that Melech, a king, consists of 3 letters, Mem, Lamed, Chaf, and how those 3 letters actually represent, Mem represents Moach, the brain, Lamed represents the heart, Lev, and the Chaf, represents Kaved, the liver. And how the idea is that these 3 organs, which are the seats of human reaction and human nature, if you really want to make Hashem king, Hashem has to be king there, over your organs. It has to be something which is totally internalized. It has to be something which becomes part of your response system. It's not enough just to pay homage or lip service, but Hashem actually has to be king over us and over our complete essence. And so Avraham's goal was to bring that level of Melech into the world, that there's only one true king, Hashem, and that he has to be king over every single person completely. And then you have these men who use the same word that can be ascribed to the Almighty, and their whole idea, their whole campaign was to literally unseat God. And their very names testify to their evil, and these can be seen from the verses, and Rashi mentions their names and points out how they actually imply their evil intentions. So this was all about a rebellion against Hashem, and Avraham became involved in this whole scenario precisely because Avraham, from the background that he came from the home that he came from, Avraham recognized evil for what it was. And he already showed himself, proved himself to be willing to strike out against evil, against all odds, and against every personal consideration and risk. He already allowed himself to be thrown into a fiery furnace from which he emerged unscathed. So he went to war against these 4 great standing armies to secure the release of innocent captives. And boy, doesn't that have a contemporary ring. We don't find that Avraham Avinu involved himself in any sort of negotiations whatsoever, not through a third party, not through a fourth party. There was no prisoner swap, but rather Avraham came against an enemy that was numerically superior. There was no logical reason to think that he would be victorious and that he would win, but yet he did this as a natural continuation of his mission of informing and bringing the whole world to the acknowledgement that everything else that you see is a ruse, that all these men who claim to be king, you know, what is that line? Steal a little and they'll throw you in jail. Steal a lot and they'll make you king. So Avraham saw all of these manifestations of evil and rebellion against Hashem. And as a continuation of his career in bringing the light of Hashem into the world, he had no choice but to join into that whole situation in order to demonstrate that there's really only one king. So our sages continue talking about this war. And again, as we have constantly emphasized, every story and every anecdote and every recital of what seems to be a tale by our sages is actually replete with tremendous psychological insight, tremendous eternal truth. And we have to understand the power of the midrash and the message of our sages for all time. And if we would begin to understand the timeless messages of what our great teachers are imparting to us, we would understand a tremendous world of life-altering truth. And so here, regarding this famous battle, there's a midrash that tells us that Avraham was chasing after these kings, but it was really Hashem who was fighting. Really Hashem was chasing them. And that Avraham would throw sand at the soldiers, and midair, the sand would turn into spears. He would throw dirt at the soldiers, and it would turn into swords. And the kings and their soldiers who were fighting against Avraham would throw spears and swords at Avraham, and midair, that would turn into sand and dirt. Well, that's very whimsical and beautiful, but what does it really mean? Because our sages don't play games. And we have to understand that these matters are actually vehicles and devices to teach us eternal truths. And essentially the point of this teaching is that God indeed made a covenant with Avraham and his descendants. And that covenant is a metaphysical thing, but it is based on, and the essence of it is that the Jewish people would be living just like Avraham. They would be emulating his faith. They would continue his legacy of standing up against evil, of standing up against all odds and personal risks. And in a manner which defies human understanding, just like Avraham's life, Hashem will reward his children for this faith with gifts that are, in a word, unnatural. Like the victory of Avraham and the throwing of the sand and the dirt, which turned into swords and spears, we can look back at our history, even our fairly recent history, and look at situations wherein we, the people of Israel, have been in wars, and we have been totally united, and we have been totally uplifted, and we have seen miracles not too far off at all from this description of our sages. Is it so far-fetched to think that Avraham Avinu could have thrown sand into the air and have it turned into swords and spears when we look back upon some of the incredibly indescribable and impossible to explain military victories of the IDF in recent years? This, indeed, is the legacy of Avraham and the continuation of that covenant, because Avraham was chosen by God to become his proxy in this world, to meet the enemy and to battle that enemy until the very end. And this is the mission of Avraham's children, really to clash with all of the world's civilizations and to shatter their essence and to reveal them for what they really are, and to disclose the lies within these civilizations. And in truth, this is exactly what we did when we confronted the army of Egypt at the Sea of Reeds. This is what we did when we clashed with the civilizations that were such major world players at the time, Greece and Rome. And where are they today? Even in the last century, the people of Israel have clashed with major world powers, and still we have emerged to be able to tell the story and to be able to testify and witness to the oneness of God to the whole world. And now, too, we seem to have entered into perhaps what might be the final stage of our clash with civilizations. Just as was promised to Avraham, we have survived in this miraculous manner, and we see that Hashem is keeping his side of the covenants, because we have been guided for 3,500 years of this unnatural gifts of our existence. And so now there may be enemies that come against the children of Avraham, against the Jewish nation, whether they are Iran, whether they are Turkey, whether they are whatever nation, whatever civilization. The implications of the war which Avraham became involved with, the implications of the covenant which Hashem made with him and all his children, is that if his descendants, his children, will take upon themselves to continue his legacy of bringing the light of the one true God into the world, then Hashem will keep his covenant as well. And our job in this world is to continue the task of Avraham, to show all the kings of the world and to show all the civilizations of the world and all the manipulators of evil that they cannot conceal the presence of the God of Israel.